All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being a part of Olive Online. If this is your first time, my name is Zainab. I'm the program manager, and today we're bringing to you a topic that is very near and dear to us, to our community of Olivers across the world. Um, I start with sharing a little bit about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She was a Swiss-American psychiatrist and a pioneer in near-death studies, and the author of the internationally best-selling book on death and dying, where she first discussed her theory of the 5 stages of grief. And she said this beautiful quote that the most beautiful people we have known are those who have been, those who know defeat, who know suffering, who know struggle, who know loss, and have found their way out of the depths. These persons have an appreciation, a sensitivity, and an understanding of life that fills them with compassion, gentleness, and a deep, loving concern. Beautiful people are those that do just not happen. They are there. Today, we're meeting those two beautiful women, Sumiya Khan, MSRD, and Amina and Syed, and I would like to introduce them. Sumiya lost her 42-year-old husband to cancer in 2017. She's a registered dietitian and founded a Sanctuary Kitchen, a nonprofit program in New Haven that partners with refugee and immigrant chefs to provide employment, training, and community building through food. Sumiya co-founded Widowed and Muslim with Amina, her dear friend since childhood. She is a mother of 2 teenagers and lives in the Bay Area. Amina Syed lost her 42-year-old husband suddenly in 2016. She's a mother of 4 children, now ages 16 to 22. After losing her husband of 19 years, Amina found herself connecting with other young Muslim widows, one of whom was her childhood best friend and co-founder Sumiya Khan. Together, they are working on establishing support and awareness for Muslim widows. Without further ado, we welcome both our speakers, Sumiya and Amina. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, did you want us to start?
Yes, please go ahead.
All right, Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It's an honor to be here with everyone. This is my first time speaking, and so I'm very nervous, and I have not done this before. So I'll just start at the beginning. I did lose my husband in 2016, and he's my husband of 19 years. I got married very young. I was 18 years old, and alhamdulillah, we had a beautiful 19 years. And what happened was he became sick all of a sudden. It looked like the flu, and it quickly progressed into, we thought, pneumonia, and then he was on a ventilator. So like in this day and age after COVID, it doesn't seem so unusual, but in 2016, that was our first experience with something like that. And I honestly thought like, okay, well, he's in the hospital and, he's going to get better. And I think that's kind of what got me through, is always having that hope, there were a lot of ups, there were a lot of downs, and there were moments where it seemed like, he's going to come home. And then there were moments where all of a sudden, we would be back to square one, or we knew it wasn't going to get any better. So it was most definitely the most difficult time of my life. And as you mentioned, I have 4 children. And at the time, my children were, the youngest was 8 and my oldest was 15. So coincidentally, we had started homeschooling them that year. So the good thing about homeschooling is that they were home. So we didn't have to worry about them going to school and being, stressed out because their dad was in the hospital. It just, like, subhanAllah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the best of planners. And that decision was one of the best decisions for all of them, because not only did it work out in that time when he was sick, but even afterwards, after he had passed, they had all this time at home with family to just process. And so in March is when he actually passed away, a month of being in the hospital. And it was the most difficult time, but I always tell people, like, the peace that I had when he actually did pass was something I didn't anticipate. And it was something very unusual, and I never have felt something like that sort of calm and peace in my entire life. And I attribute that to, I know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was with me during that time, and it's what got me through. So for me, the biggest piece of everything was my faith. And it was kind of just what I was holding on to. And, it's hard because you're making dua and you're praying for a good outcome. And when that doesn't happen, how do you cope and deal with, the fact that like I was praying, I was doing this, and then, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't hear me or didn't answer my prayer. And for me, it was a very different feeling. It was, and this is the hard part, is I had to explain this to my children, where we as adults can process that and kind of make our peace with dealing with difficulty and loss. Trying to explain to my children was probably the most difficult part, because for them, they also said the same thing. They're like, well, we were making dua that Baba was going to come home, and then he didn't. So that, I think, was difficult, but it also caused me to think internally and assess my relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and kind of build on that. So alhamdulillah, there is, we know that there's khair in everything that happens to us. It's hard in the moments and it's hard afterwards. But I think the biggest lesson for me was to just keep going back to it. And, there's highs and there's lows, but if it's kind of like you're holding on to that rope, right? The rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where you know that ultimately everything that happens is from him. And if we accept him as our creator, then we have to be okay with whatever is written for us. And easier said than done. And I still struggle with that, on the daily basis. But alhamdulillah, I think one of the most, I guess, eye-opening moments was after my husband has passed, when I was looking for, I really wanted to connect with other widows. And I started going to local support groups. And it was nice to meet other people who were young, widowed, have children in my same situation. But the faith piece was missing. And I found that to be really, really hard. Because when you're sitting in a room with people who definitely are in your same space, but for us as Muslims, we have that hope that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reunite us with those that we've lost. And for the other people, they didn't have that. And so it was like, we're never going to see this person again. And so that devastation, it really made me realize how blessed we are that we are given this hope, right? And that was actually the way I explained it to my children, is I would tell them, like, Baba, he's not with us, but it doesn't mean he doesn't exist, right? He is somewhere else, and inshallah, we will be with him again. If Allah wills, we live a good life, we do what we can, we do sadaqah jariyah for him, which is our connection to him, the things that we can send for him. And then our hope is that we are reunited with him. So just that in itself is such a huge blessing for us, especially those of us that have lost loved ones, be it a spouse or a child or anyone like near and dear to you. That is kind of a lot of the times what gets you through. And so then that's when I started actually connecting with other Muslim widows. By chance, people would call me and say, hey, I know a widow, would you mind talking to them? She's young. And I would say, of course. So that's how this all started. And then the next year, when Sumiya, who is like my childhood best friend, she lost her husband, it kind of was surreal because we had grown up together. We spent so much of our childhood on the phone with each other. And so for us to share something like that so close together, it kind of was the catalyst for where we are now, which is trying to help other women, Muslim women who are widowed, young or old, find that space where they can feel heard. And I think that's one of the biggest things, is when you're going through something, anything, and you go and you sit in a support group, in a group of people who are in similar difficulties, then when you unload and it's a different feeling than when you're just talking to your friends or someone or family or other people who may not be in that same boat. And that's, I think, one of the things that Sumiya and I realized is these women would come to our online sessions, and we have a WhatsApp group, and they would just like chat and say, today was a really rough day, you know, my kids were giving me a hard time, I'm missing my co-parent or whatever. And then the other women would chime in and they would just also share the same struggle because we were all in the same boat. And just that in itself was so healing. And we got such great feedback from that I mean, I think we were surprised. We knew it would be great, but we've had really positive feedback. And we've also had older members join. And it's the same thing. It's like you're in a situation you're in a space where you feel accepted, you feel heard, and you do feel better when you leave. And that's the whole point of being in a support group. So alhamdulillah, we're working on it and it's a work in progress. And because Sumiya and I are so busy, it's taking time. But so far, alhamdulillah, I think we are happy with the response that we've gotten from people. And it is something that I feel like is also part of our healing process. I know it gives me a lot of peace to know that, the space that we provide, it's helping someone who I know how they feel and I have been in their shoes. And when it happened to me, I didn't have that space. So I think that definitely gives me a lot of peace. I do wish that our community supported us a little bit better. I think that's one of the things I realized is that our masajid, they're not ready to kind of support these types of specific situations, whether it's child loss, parent loss. We don't have, for the most part, support groups. And a lot of other communities have established that, like churches and other non-denominational organizations. They see the benefit in it and they realize the need for it. And I think that hopefully, inshallah, we're getting there. But that was kind of one of the things that I think we realized is we hope that it grows into this thing where all of our communities have a space for this. And, it's like, subhanAllah, what you're doing with seniors is also like, it's so amazing. And I think for me, as I'm seeing my parents age and I'm seeing what their needs are, and I'm like, oh, wow, we really are not supporting them enough. And there's not a lot for them to, like, not a lot of spaces where they can go and have activities, have connection. Because again, for someone who's lost, your life partner, you realize that sense of connectivity and being with someone and not being lonely is huge, right? And a lot of times people don't realize that, whether you're in our situation or whether you are someone who is aging and whether you have a spouse or not, that sense of wanting to be with people and heard and, connected, we all share that, right? So alhamdulillah, I think that, this is really such a beautiful space. And I really thank you all for the opportunity to come and share my story. And I actually don't know what else to say. My children now are the ages 22 to my youngest is 16. And again, when I look back on the past 8 years, I don't know how things have happened. I don't know how, I ended up with 3 children who, mashallah, have graduated from college. And it truly is Allah's mercy. Like, it is not my doing. It is not like I'm here as a mother and I have my family and we all support the kids. But ultimately, it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that, even though He removed like the source of the risk and the support and the emotional support and the love, I can't say I've ever felt like I do feel that hole in my life of my partner, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has surrounded me with so much love and so much support and, made so many things easy that I thought were going to be really, really difficult, and alhamdulillah. And I think as long as we come back to that, as difficult as it is, I think that's what gets us through. And one of the hardest lessons I've had to teach my kids is that just because you were tested with this like really difficult test, it doesn't mean you won't be tested again, right? I think a lot of the times we hope that, okay, well, God has tested us with like this mountainous test. Now this is it, inshallah. Then the rest of it, we're just gonna kind of, we just got to do good and make our way through, and then hopefully we're not tested again. But that's not the reality, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us He's going to test us again and again. And that sometimes is the hard part, is that you just got to keep coming back. So, alhamdulillah, jazakallah khair for the space and for letting me share my story. And I want Sumaya to talk because she's much better at this than I am. Are you there, Sumaya?
I am here. Zainab, do you need to chime in?
No, go ahead. Thank you so much, Amina, and thank you, Sumiya, for being here. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It's nice to be here. Thank you for opening this space for us. I see some familiar faces, some of my aunties and uncles here that my parents were dear friends with. I have, a little bit of a similar story to Amina. I was also, got married soon after college to Arthur Ali, who's actually from Orange County. Some of you may have known him and his family in Lamita in the South Bay. We, alhamdulillah, were married for 16 years, and we have two kids who are now almost 18 and almost 15. We were living on the East Coast in Connecticut. After grad school, we moved out there where Arthur started his career. And in 2016, up until that point, he had been, not 16, sorry, 2017, he had been very healthy. We both are in the natural medicine world. I'm a dietitian and he was a naturopath. So we had a healthy lifestyle, no risk factors, no genetic issues. Alhamdulillah, he was very fit and doing well, and had this cough that just wouldn't disappear, and eventually was diagnosed as a cancer of unknown origin, meaning he had stage 4 cancer, but they could not find where it started, where the initial tumor was. Despite that, though, they started treatment and with what they suspected to be the source, and alhamdulillah, he was doing better. He was feeling better. He went from not having any energy, from being very fatigued, and this cough that just was, really interfering with his quality of life, to feeling better. Like the cough went away, his energy was back, he was able to exercise and go to work and so forth. The doctors were very hopeful and optimistic that he was going to get through this. And this happened right before Ramadan that year. In fact, the day before Ramadan started is when we got the diagnosis, and he started his chemotherapy the next day. And so that was like, Ramadan for us that year was just very different. He wasn't fasting, obviously, and managing all that. But, we're like, okay, it's Ramadan. This is a special month. We will pray, we'll do sadaqah, like, taking advantage of the blessings of the month. Unfortunately, 4 months later, after he was getting better and we were talking about, transitioning from his chemo, he started feeling worse in a different way. And sure enough, that's when they found the tumor, and then it was just a rapid decline for the next 2 months, in and out of hospitals, and his treatment changed, and he had to start chemo again in a different way. But same thing, despite that, like I'm normally a very optimistic person, and I was holding out hope. And he, because he was in the medical field and he was basically being treated in the hospital where he worked, and where he did integrative medicine at the cancer center there in New Haven. He was now a patient, and his colleagues were treating him, and everybody was like hopeful, and no one really wanted to admit that this was that he wasn't going to get better until the very end. And so it came to a point where, the doctors were saying that if you're lucky, you have 2 months and, to start making arrangements and letting family know and so forth. So we were it was a gut punch and, not prepared for that at all. And unfortunately, we didn't have 2 months, we had 2 days. And, but at that point, he showed a contentment and gratitude for his life and his family and his friends. And yeah, and that happened. And of course I was devastated, and it was the first time in my 30 some years where I felt my faith being shaken. I lost my father when I was 20, right before our wedding, actually, and it was sudden. And it was my faith and my practice and my community, my family that really, got me through that loss of my father. And like Amina was saying, there was a dearth of support for families dealing with loss. And it wasn't just like Muslim faith-based resources. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, when my father passed away, there wasn't really anything like in terms like therapy wasn't really something that people did. There was definitely not any support groups that we were aware of. I had 2 younger siblings. My mom was relatively young. And we just had to like manage and deal with the loss the best we could. Of course, our faith, being Muslim, and our community and our friends and our families, supported us. And but there wasn't really an outlet to talk about grief and to process grief. And when we struggled as children, I mean, I wasn't a child at that point, but my siblings were, and even myself as a 20-year-old, and my mother also struggled, and having gone through that once already, really made me worry for my children, because at that time they were 8 and 11, and I didn't want them to go through the same struggles that I did and my siblings did. And I also didn't want to go through the same path that my mom did it with her struggles as a young widow. And it right away, like Amina was my person that I called, and we commiserated together because she had just gone through it herself. And even though it was very new for her too, it had been just over a year. And so I know it was hard for her too, to like relive all that grief again, like it triggering her and having to attend the funeral and all of that. But she did it. She is a true friend and sister. And, it was, definitely a shock to our community and our families. And, I went to therapy, and I took the kids to a family support group that was local in Connecticut. And it was helpful, I won't say it wasn't, but like Amina said, that faith piece was missing, and the cultural piece also, with our like Muslim culture, Indo-Pakistani culture, the way our communities work around this. And so there were elements that they couldn't answer, when it came to like some of the things that I was struggling with in terms of faith and, the question of why. Same thing, like I could process it one way, and I know, what Allah, the Quran says and our Sunnah says and what Allah tells us about hardship. But same thing, like for the kids, like how do you explain it to them, and how can, they're young, they're not accountable for their responses and how they react to something like this. So those are things that I struggled with, and I had a lot of questions, and I sought advice from elders in our community, our scholars in the community, to process this. And for a while, you know, like praying and
Bulgarian?
fasting and all of that, like,
Yeah.
it was a struggle. I kept at it, but it felt like I was just going through the motions. Um, but you know, they say like you keep knocking and you don't know. I think Rumi says it, keep knocking and you don't know when the door will open. And so I kept that, you know, that was my faith, you know, this is like, I know what our tradition says, and I held out that hope that Amina referred to about getting through this. And, you know, having somebody like Amina and then also connecting with some of the other women that she had met in her process, you know, it was like just a simple chat group initially. And, you know, unless you've, you know, I had, alhamdulillah, like amazing support from my family, my friends, our community that we lived in, like the kids' school, their teachers, and my neighbors, and, you know, everybody showed up and really supported. But there is something extra special about somebody who's gone through it themselves, that where they can just understand and relate in a different way. And it's not, you know, the things that are being said or shared, it just holds a deeper meaning, right? Because they get it. They've been there. They understand what you're experiencing. And so in my process, you know, the things, my takeaways, the lessons I kind of learned, is that one, you know, grief isn't linear. You know, Zeta mentioned the stages of grief earlier, and now the understanding is that it's not like, okay, first I go through, I don't even remember what the stages are, but like denial and then acceptance and anger and all of that. It's like you don't necessarily go one after the other. It's you're kind of ping-ponging between those 5 stages throughout. It's not linear. It's very messy, and you're gonna have great days where you feel like you accept it, and then there's gonna be days that you feel angry and upset, and you know, you're on other days you're just like, wait, is this real? Like, did this happen? Am I just dreaming it? Am I gonna wake up from this nightmare? And you know, grief also doesn't have an end date. You know, it's something that it's going to be lifelong. You're going to hold it, but and you're going to you don't move on from it. You do move forward. You're able to like process it differently as time does go by, and it's something that you learn to adjust your life around. It starts off with, you know, being a huge part of your life, and like that's all you can see and that's all you can feel. And gradually it becomes a piece, just a piece of you that's kind of there all the time in the background. And sometimes it just creeps forward, you know, something might happen and you remember something and it triggers it, and it feels fresh. And other times you just, you know, it's there, and you're moving forward with your life, and you're working and you have kids to raise and so forth. What also helped for me was, like I said, you know, the support of my family and my friends and my community, just showing up. And, you know, what I found most helpful was the people who they just showed up and they just did things. They didn't ask. One of the hardest, situations to be put in is, and we all do it, and I find myself doing it as well, is like, you know, please let us know if we can help you in any way, or, you know, or people will ask like, how can I help? And it comes from such a sincere, generous place. But when you're in that situation, you don't know what you need. You don't know what you want, and you have to like think about it, and you're just, you know, juggling all kinds of feelings. And so people just, you know, showed up with food. They, like, my friends organized a meal train so that I wasn't being overwhelmed with tons of food on one day, you know, scheduling that, groceries, cleaning, taking my kids out on play dates, so that they could have, you know, an outlet to, you know, play and be happy, to give me a break as well, you know, taking me out for coffee, going for a walk. just not really asking, just coming. I mean, obviously you do in a way that it's not imposing. So like, hey, I want to come over and take you out for a walk, so you can get a break or, change of scenery. And so I still have the option to say, no, I'm not up for it or not, but it's not me having to come up with ways people could help me, just if that makes sense. The other piece that really got me through this was my work with Sanctuary Kitchen. Um, uh, it's a small nonprofit in New Haven working with refugee and immigrant chefs, mostly women, and through culinary training and cultural events, and being surrounded by mostly it was like Syrian, Afghan, Sudanese women who left their war-torn homes and countries and were starting new in America, and with their children and their families, being around them gave me a model to follow on resilience and loss. These people had experienced the horrors of war and lost multiple family members and lost their homes and all their belongings, and yet they were here starting their lives new with smiles on their face and generous hearts. We know, it's in our cultures, right, to be generous and hospitable, but despite going through what they went through, they were still having that generous spirit. And so I really look to them as examples of how to live life after such tragic loss. And, yes, I was, working with them and helping them start their economic futures and so forth, but I benefited more from them than they did from me, I believe. But that work and working with them and developing relationships with them really gave me some purpose. Two things: raising my children and my work with Sanctuary Kitchen really helped me get out of bed, on a daily basis afterwards. It gave me some purpose. It gave me some hope, and somewhere I could feel like my energy in. Other things that really help, I mentioned like grief support and therapy. It's really necessary. And if you can find, Muslim resources, that's, Muslim therapist, that's really great. There are some slowly, especially after the pandemic, grief support groups popping up in the Muslim community. Some are virtual, some are through masjids. It's really amazing that those are happening. We need more of them, and that's something that we're working on with Widowed and Muslim. But it's really necessary. We have our faith and the things that we do, but there is also a systematic way to help process grief as well. And with your kids, really encouraging them to do it, depending on their age. If they're young, sometimes you have to make that decision for them and not really give them a choice. Whether or not they're going to do it, it's more about like you give them choices about who and how, but saying like this is kind of a necessary step, because again, grief, it takes a while. And with my children, they didn't need it right away. It was like a year later or 2 years later, and they kind of tag teamed and they struggled in different ways at different times. And it manifested differently for both of them. They were very different children. But it was something that like the therapy really helped help them get through it, because I'm limited in how much I could help them in that way as well. And then lastly, especially as time passes, people feel sometimes nervous or uncomfortable to talk about your person. And it's really helpful to be able to share stories about my husband, not just for me, but for my children, and keep his stories and his memories alive. And we like it. We like to talk about them. Yeah, it might make us feel a little wistful, but it's not something to avoid. People might get nervous and say like, I don't want her to make her sad, or I don't want to, change the mood of the situation, of the space, but it's not. It makes us happy to talk about our person and remember them and share stories, and especially if you knew them, if you were a friend, sharing childhood stories, because it's keeping their memory alive. It's showing another side of them that the kids maybe not didn't experience, and to also just remember remember them. I could go on and talk about what didn't help, if that's if we have time for that, or we can go into questions.
Please share.
Okay. There are a couple of things that, and I know Amina can add to this list as well. Things that platitudes that people share in these situations with grief. And again, I know that it's coming from a good place, and if you're not used to this, you struggle with what to say. But like I said, offering help, just showing up, listening, is one of the best things you can do. And trying to avoid certain platitudes like, you're so strong. Yes, we are strong. We don't really have a choice in that manner, especially if you're a parent, you got to show up for your kids, right? You don't have a choice to check out and let them raise themselves. Um, um, so it's one of those things. It's just like, it just makes you feel like, yeah, we're in this horrible situation. We're coping as best as we can. But to be called out like that, I don't know, it diminishes it a bit, if that makes sense. Other things, the typical, like, he's in a better place, be patient, all of those things. Yes, we know. We are very familiar with those things, and we understand that. It doesn't make us feel better, though, being reminded of that. Because as Muslims, we have that understanding, right, of being patient, of being grateful, of understanding that this life is finite, and that we are looking for the better, in the hereafter. It just doesn't make us feel less sad. I mean, it can, but it also doesn't make us miss them less necessarily. The ubiquitous, like, how are you question. It's like, yeah, we're gonna say alhamdulillah, because that's what um we we say, right? Because that's how we understand life. But it's such a big and broad question, and so a better way would be to ask, like, how was your morning? Or how did this appointment go? How was your child's parent-teacher conference? Like, how was that experience for you, rather than just being more specific, because that's going to be a lot more manageable to answer, and and it will help tap into the feelings that we might be experiencing in that moment, rather than a general how are you, where we're not going to start dumping on, like, how hard everything is. We're just going to say, it's good, alhamdulillah. So those were kind of a couple, like, do's and don'ts that I wanted to share in our experience.
Yeah, I want to jump in on the how are you. Um, I think it's a lot more helpful sometimes when, instead of asking a question, you just make a statement like, it's so nice to see you today, or I'm so glad I was able to spend time with you. Because again, it takes the onus of the burden of the answering for the person who's already struggling. Then it puts it kind of like, it's just a nice statement. Hopefully makes them feel better, instead of having for them to process your question and, like Sumiya said, figure out an answer. And then the other piece that Sumiya was talking about is like sabr, right? One of the things that I think it's also a cultural thing is people will tell you have sabr, and then they'll also, a lot of times, if you're crying or you're emotional, they'll say it at that time. Where I feel like people don't understand the concept of sabr. Just because I'm crying doesn't mean I'm not having sabr, right? So it can be a little bit condescending to say that in a moment where someone is very emotional, because you have to understand that they are being patient, but it's just Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also has given us emotions and has made it okay for us to cry. It's just we don't say those things that are displeasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in those moments. You know, God created us and He created us with all these feelings, and it's okay to express those feelings as long as we're doing it in alignment with how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us to. So that's one of the things I think that was kind of a big one for me, especially a lot of the times a Pakistani background and older people will say that a lot. And even though it's a it's understood that that is what we need to do in those moments, it can be very unhelpful to say it to somebody who is like actively grieving or openly crying at that time. So it's, for me, I'm just like, give me a hug. That's all I need. I don't even need anything. I don't need for you to say anything. Just your physical presence and, a hug or holding a hand, it means so much. And it can really, really make that person feel safe and feel, comforted. And that's all we're trying to do, right? When we go to visit somebody who's grieving, we want to comfort them. That's the goal. And so you want to think about what is most comforting for that person, and not, a lot of the times it turns into like, there have been people who come and then they'll start telling you all of the, the ahadith and the Quran, and it becomes, they're trying to comfort you with the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it doesn't necessarily work that way when you're really compromised. So that's, even though when you're in a state where you're mentally healthy and you go to a lecture and you listen to it and you're like, oh, this is uplifting, in a moment of grief, that can be very unhelpful. So I would just say the same thing that Sumiya, that mind what is said to the person who is grieving, or the children, or whoever it is that you're speaking to, because the goal is to make them feel better, safe, comforted, and it's not like a duty that we have to tell them, okay, well, this is what you're supposed to do. This is how you're supposed to grieve in the right Islamic way, which a lot of the times people do, just because they don't know what else to say.
One more was starting any sentence with at least.
Yeah.
At least he's in a better place. At least you had a good marriage. At least blah, blah, blah. That also is not helpful. It doesn't make us feel any better. And sometimes it makes us feel worse, because it's like, yeah, we had a good marriage, and that, and the loss of that feels worse, right? Makes it feel worse. And so, and this applies to any situation when somebody's upset. It doesn't have to be around grief. You never want to start a sentence with at least. And I know you're trying, it comes off as like trying to be helpful and trying to throw a positive spin on something that's horrible. But that's not really, it's not helpful at all.
Well, first and foremost, thank you both for being so vulnerable and so, kind in sharing us with your deepest feelings and thoughts, and what you was going through your minds during those times that you had to probably relive while sharing your stories. There's a lot of love for you both and a lot of du'as in the chat, so please take your time to read it. Definitely there are people who know you personally, and I've heard about you, so please do take that time. Now my question, and others, please get your questions ready. You're welcome to share it with your voices, unmute yourself and share, or put it in the chat. But one question that comes to my mind, for both of you, who inspires you? Or the most amongst, it could be a family member or somebody that, really gave you that role model feeling when you were going through what you were going through, and made you want to move, be that person, or just brought in that positive feeling. Anybody in your family or someone out there who inspired you?
Well, I want to say first and foremost, my mother, because my mother is a very, very patient woman. I am not. My mom, mashallah, she has a lot of strength and she has just an enormous amount of patience. And she's gone through different struggles in her life, but both my parents actually are inspirational for me, but specifically my mother. And I have struggled with her at times just because, the Indo-Pac, version of grieving is very different than kind of our generation. But like, mashallah, mashallah, her strength. Yeah, I mean, for me, that's a big one.
Sumiya, anyone for you?
I have a couple. I feel like I get, bits and pieces from different people. I think for me also my mother, because she went through what I did. And, by her example of how she, her journey through grief taught me what was good and what wasn't as well, in my own process and how to help my children with their grief. My father, Allah yarhamu, also, I feel like I like to say I take after him a lot. He was a very patient person, very positive, also a very positive outlook, and had this, and both my parents had this like uh, placing this importance of service to the community, and instilled that in me and my siblings. And so doing service for the community that was an outlet for me, right, in my grief process. I also, like I said, the women I worked with in Sanctuary Kitchen, again, they were examples of life after loss and how to cope with a beautiful patience, with hope and generosity. And I took a lot from their examples in that. And then of course I want to say Amina, because she was a very current and recent example for me to follow. And and I'd like to say that we helped each other, but I feel like she definitely helped me more.
No, not true. We helped. And I think Somaya will agree, also the women in our group.
Yes.
They give us very regular inspiration.
Right.
Amina, how often does your group meet?
Once a month. So actually we have a WhatsApp, and on the WhatsApp people talk very regularly. It kind of comes and goes when people are feeling chatty, they'll share. So that's kind of an open forum. The Zoom meetings are once a month.
And we have about 75
Wow.
members now, I think, from around the world, not just in the US. And then we have like little pockets of people in cities who are, local to each other.
And we started at 7.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And in 1 year that like it went from 7 to like 40, I remember the first year. And we have a website now, widowedandmuslim.org, where we've kind of curated resources on grief, not just for widows, but grief in general. And we've kind of culled through both Muslim and non-Muslim resources that we found helpful to manage grief, on parenting, on Islamic guidance on various issues, and so forth. And we're hoping to expand that.
All right. There's a question in the chat, Sumiya. Is the Sanctuary Kitchen still serving the community?
Yes, it's in New Haven, Connecticut, and I'm no longer there. I moved back to California 3 years ago. So the program is still there, and they do culinary training and catering and employment for both refugee and immigrant women who like to cook.
Thank you for sharing. Any questions? Anyone wants to speak up, or I'm ready with my next question. If anyone doesn't have one, you can unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Zainab, this is Rubiana. I just want to just send hugs to both of you. we knew Arthur in the community as a young person. And just what you're sharing is amazing. And thank you for your courage. And I learned that when we're at loss of words, it's okay. A hug is just as accepted as any comment. So we don't have to think of smart comments. Just being there and hug and listening. So thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you for listening.
All
And I
right.
wanted to comment on one of the comments in the chat where it says, avoid, I understand what you are going through. Yes. Because to be honest, like even Sumiya and I, our situations are very, very similar, but I don't think that we would ever say that to one another because everyone's grief and loss is so different. So when you say that to another person, it doesn't, for me at least, it doesn't necessarily make me feel good. And I've had the experience of a lot of people who've had different losses say that, oh, I understand, I lost my cousin or whatever. And especially when you've lost a spouse, it's really difficult to hear stuff like that. So I would say try not to say words like that because it sounds like it would be the right thing to say, that you understand what they're going through. But the reality is, like Sumaya was saying, everyone's grief, it's so deep and chaotic and it can be, and it's messy, like she said. So saying that doesn't necessarily make the other person feel great.
Great points. Thank you for sharing. Any other questions? If you want to speak up, please do, or I can ask a few questions. So I would like to ask you both, what are you the most proud of?
I want to say for me, that's a pretty easy one. I'm most proud of my kids. I think like any mom, but especially because they have gone through such a huge tragedy and still kept moving through and going forward. And definitely they've had difficulty and they've had hard times, but mashallah, they are also, like, back to your previous question, they are also an inspiration for me because I'm an adult and I know how much I struggle. And to see children who they don't have that level of faith and understanding when it comes to religion, and they're so young, and for them to, go through this loss and then kind of still do amazing things and keep like one foot in front of the other, one day at a time. I think that's amazing. And that's what I'm probably the most proud of.
Beautifully shared. Sumiya, anything that comes to your mind?
I think I'm proud of the widow and Muslim community that we've created, and having that, there was this void, and Amina had this vision to fill it, and it's really taken off. And alhamdulillah, like I'm glad that we're both in a place that our experience can now benefit somebody else who's in the throes of it. We're a couple of years out, and so our experience is a little bit different now than it was, our first year or first 2 years. So yeah, alhamdulillah, I'm glad that we were able to create that in spite of our grief.
All right.
Zainab, I do have a question, Ms. Zainab.
Go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, Ms. Amina, Ms. Sumiya. My question is, in the initial stages, you said you were working with other, organizations in the process of grief, but you said faith was missing. But could you identify maybe 1, 2, or 3 things that you did take or you did learn from those non-Muslim organizations? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Number one, they're very organized, very, very organized. I actually volunteer at the organization that I initially went to because their setup is great. They have really understood the needs of a grieving population and implemented it. Like their setup is great. So they can do one-on-one, they do group, and that's support groups. And then they also do therapy. So that's one of the things that I think that they're years ahead of us in, that is that they have an actual, like a whole process. When somebody comes in, they'll do an intake, and they go kind of like step by step by step, and then they have different groups for different ages. They have older spouse loss, younger spouse loss, younger spouse loss with kids, right? Younger spouse loss without kids. So they're very also trying to really, really fine tune it, so that you're in a very, like, a group that is exactly kind of specific to your needs. And I think that that's one of the biggest things, is I just feel like they're very organized and they understand the needs of the community.
And they
So
provide training, right, Amina, the peer support training?
They do. They also provide training for volunteers, and that way because what happens is the people who come in for this grief support eventually turn into volunteers. They'll come back a few years later when they're in a better space, like kind of like Sumiya and I are further out, and they'll come back and then they'll be the peer support volunteers and then run the groups. So it's like you have this flow of people. So it's really something, and inshallah, I think we can do it. It'll just take
I'm gonna also share about that the church group that provides services for.
Yeah, that was one of the things that one of the women who eventually joined our group, the Muslim Sisters, she had found a group up in like the Livermore area, and it was called Missing Man Ministry. And if you look it up, they have a website, and it's a church-based organization that helps widows, specifically widows. It doesn't matter what faith you are. And what they do is they'll do an intake. As a widow, you go in there, they'll do an intake, and then they'll assess your needs. They'll help you with financial planning. They'll, go through all of that with you. And then if you need a handyman, if you need something fixed at home, you need your lawn mowed, they will send somebody out. And these are all people that are just out of their church community pool. And everyone has different talents, and then they kind of have a database. And then whenever somebody needs something, they'll send it to you. And it's all free of charge, which again, we can do. Our Muslim community is a wealth of resources. It's just about organizing and getting it going.
Thank you both.
Wonderful. Thank you so much both for sharing. One of the biggest things I think after this session that comes to our mind is the education. Sometimes, the things that you said, that people, the do's and don'ts, sometimes people don't know what to say, so they allude to those terminology. And when you don't know what to say, sabr and hadith or Quran or whatever comes to your mind. So I think having these discussions and like Rubina shared, a courageous woman like you coming forefront with your stories and sharing these do's and don'ts really makes a difference for us and the younger generation ahead about the possibilities. So everyone in this room, again, thank you, Sumiya, Amina. Forgive me, Sumiya, I mispronounced your name earlier. Now I know. I am happy to bring this program to our community, and we are grateful. Again, like I said, this conversation can continue, and we would love to have you back in the future. Everyone else, thank you for attending, your patience. We do have a meeting starting at 12, so hence I'm going to have to end today's session on our scheduled time at noon. Thank you. Sumiya and Amina, if you want to just say bye-bye to our Olivers, they're all very grateful for your
thank you for giving us
I don't
this
know if you see
opportunity.
them clapping and cheering you on for your, again, your presence here.
Thank you so much.
thank you.
Jazakallah khair. Keep us on your du'as, please.
Jazakallah khair. Everyone, thank you
Thank you. Thank you, both of you.
Olive Community Services is a 501c3 nonprofit organization based in Southern California that provides culturally appropriate services to seniors, their family, and the community. Through its physical and virtual interactive programs, Olive engages participants in a variety of ways that promotes health and well-being. To learn more about Olive Community Services, to get involved, or to make a donation, please visit www.olivecs.org or email info@olivecs.org. Be a change maker, and together, let's live, learn, and thrive.